Boshu! Hello, friends. My name is Elizabeth Cronk-Warner, and my pronouns are she and hers. And I'm very excited to welcome you here today for what's going to be an excellent conversation about States of Health, the newest book from Leslie Francis and John Francis. And as I like to do anytime that we come together, I do want to acknowledge that we today are on this land, which is named for the Ute tribe. It is the traditional and ancestral homeland of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshu, and Ute tribes. The University of Utah recognizes and respects the enduring relationship that exists between many indigenous peoples and their traditional homelands. We respect the sovereign relationship between tribes, states, and the federal government, and we affirm the University of Utah's commitment to a partnership with Native nations and urban Indian communities through research, education, and community activities. This valley was long time focus of the place for tribes to get together and share with one another and trade and to come together in unison. So it's really wonderful that in this day and age, we can continue the tradition of coming together in the valley and coming together today for what is going to be a wonderful discussion of a great book together with a fantastic lineup of panelists. I'm so sorry that I can't be with you today. I'm unfortunately in a meeting in Washington, D.C., but I am very excited for this book and the work that Dr. Francis and Dr. Francis have put into this book. It's a very timely topic, this topic of whether or not inequity between the availability of healthcare services between states is moral, is just. And I'm really excited for this conversation. And I'm so glad that you can be here to join us for this important work. So Chamagwich, thank you very much. And I'll turn it over to our amazing moderator. Thank you.
So thank you, everybody, for coming to learn about a very, very important topic in the law and in health. We have an incredible suite of panelists here today who will be discussing some key questions about federalism in health. Number one, how should governmental power be divided? And two, how does this overlay with health? These are tremendous questions. Federalism has felled some very important laws and policies in the US, like an axe to a tree. For example, many of you are aware of the case United States versus Lopez, which struck down the Gun-Free School Zones Act of 1990. Also, in United States versus Morrison, the Supreme Court struck down parts of the Violence Against Women Act of 1994. And perhaps most famously, in NFIB versus Sebelius, the Supreme Court struck down the requirement that states expand Medicaid health insurance, a program that promised universal health care for the poor, but then became optional due to the Supreme Court's decision. Of course, as the panelists will, I'm sure, get into, federalism is a matter not just for the Supreme Court, but for many branches of government at all levels. Specifically, this book is about federalism and health. Health is an undeniable good that most people would like to have. It's literally a matter of life and death. So the stakes for these federalism debates are even higher here. This book covers so many different statutes and regulatory programs that it is difficult to count. It leaves us with innumerable questions about federalism's present and future. So with that, please allow me to introduce the panelists. On my left, we have Leslie and John Francis. Drawing on their combined expertise in philosophy, political theory, law, and political science, Leslie and John Francis have published 4 books and many articles together, spanning topics as diverse as federalism and land use, privacy, and the ethical use of information for public health. States of Health is their latest book, with a focus on the ethical and policy issues raised when federal systems address questions of deep moral and social disagreement. Leslie Francis is the Distinguished Alfred C. Emery Professor of Law and Distinguished Professor of Philosophy at the University of Utah. She specializes in bioethics, disability law and ethics, and privacy. John Francis is a research professor of political science at the U. He has served as Senior Associate Vice President for Academic Affairs. He received his PhD in political science from the University of Michigan and his AB from Stanford University. His areas of specialization include British electoral politics, European comparative public policy, and regulatory regimes in the United States, the EU, and the UK. All right, next we have Justice Christine Durham, who served on the Utah Supreme Court for 35 years and spent 10 of those as Chief Justice. She has been active in statewide and national organizations concerning the judiciary and the law, including President of the National Association of Women Judges, Council of the American Law Institute, and Board of Trustees of the Rand Corporation's Institute for Civil Justice. She is currently co-chair of Utah's Access to Justice Commission and on the governing board of the Utah Center for Legal Inclusion. Her first jobs out of law school included teaching law and medicine at the Duke Medical School, research for the first laws regulating physician assistants, and drafting early language for elder law development. Next, we have Philip M. Singer, Associate Professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Utah, where he teaches and researches health and public health policy. Singer has published extensively on state health policy, especially the Affordable Care Act, Medicaid, and other social welfare programs. His work has been published in the New England Journal of Medicine, JAMA, and Health Affairs, amongst other journals. He earned both his PhD in Health Services, Organization, and Policy, and his Master of Health Service Administration, Health Management, and Policy, that was a mouthful, from the University of Michigan, and earned Bachelor of Science degrees in Anthropology and Political Science from BYU. And Dr. John Francis was on the search committee when Dr. Singer was hired here at the U, so any complaints about Dr. Singer can be lodged with John. All right. Last but not least, we have Kif Augustine Adams, the Ivan Matus Chair and Professor of Law at Brigham Young University's J. Reuben Clark Law School. Augustine Adams joined BYU's law school in 1995 after practicing administrative law with Covington and Burling in Washington, D.C. She earned her JD from Harvard University and her BA from Brigham Young University. Augustine Adams' scholarship focuses on intersections among migration, gender, race, and citizenship. With co-authors, she recently published Unaccompanied Migrant Children in U.S. Government Custody, 2014 to 2023, in International Migration Review. She has taught feminist legal theory for upwards of 20 years. Please, a round of applause for our panel. With that, I turn it over to my colleague, Professor Leslie Francis, to introduce her book.
So this is working, right? Did I make it work? No. It's got a green light. Okay. Okay, so first of all, thank you, people online, people here, and especially panelists and moderator. I'm going to just spend a couple minutes introducing a couple of themes from the book. I unfortunately am going to have to, it's not, oh, there we go. I'm going to have to stand up to read these epigraphs, but I think they...
you can move closer there.
I think they capture, yeah, maybe I'll just do that. I think they capture our aims in the book. The first, Abraham Lincoln, a house divided against itself cannot stand. This government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. One of the themes in our book is, are there some differences among states that get so bad that they are intolerable in the same society? So just to give you one example, the average lifespan in the longest lifespan state, Hawaii, is about 10 years more than in the lowest average lifespan, Mississippi. in a single country. And Mississippi is the largest net taker of federal funds in comparison to the federal tax dollars they pay of any state in the United States. So we all have an interest in what's going on in Mississippi, which is the second important theme. I'm cognizant of the interrelatedness of all communities and states. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We're caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Martin Luther King Jr. And finally, a theme for us is that there are advantages to federalism that shouldn't be forgotten, but we think they can only really be realized with movement. So we included the quote from Justice Kavanaugh in his concurring opinion in Dobbs. Some of the other abortion-related legal questions raised by today's decision are not especially difficult as a constitutional matter, Justice Kavanaugh said. For example, may a state bar a resident of that state from traveling to another state to obtain an abortion? In my view, the answer is no, based on the constitutional right to interstate travel, a right that is being challenged right now and also surely to reach the court in the next few years. I should say we had a draft of this book written before Dobbs. We obviously didn't send it to the publisher. We rewrote the whole thing after Dobbs because we saw the handwriting on the wall. So this is a book of political theory, political philosophy, about federalism, ethics of healthcare. We try to have a lot in it for providers as well as for scholars and health policy folks. We want to argue and explore both the strengths and the weaknesses of federalism and to think about whether we've put certain kinds of decisions in the context of today in the right places. So federalism is a political system not just in which there's devolution of authority, but in which there's constitutionally recognized authority in subnational units. There are many federalist systems across the globe. There are just a few here on this slide, like our neighbor to the south, Mexico, and our neighbor to the north, Canada, many others. Classic justifications for federalism include recognition of cultural, social differences. While you still get economies of scale, the federal government has the vast advantage of money. Okay. Experimentation, the Brandeisian justification, the idea of smaller units, government closer. Two levels that can protect rights. That's part of Madison's argument. And, you know, if we've got things going badly, it's better to have them only going badly in some parts of a country if you can move than have them going badly everywhere. So we explore, the book has chapters on public health, differences in health status, the roles of the federal government in paying for care and the states in paying for care, confidentiality, end of life care, beginning of life care, quality of care, medical malpractice, licensing, where there are huge differences among the states that you wouldn't think. A nurse practitioner can practice independently in Illinois. If they move across the river to Missouri, they can't. You know, just huge things like that. And of course, although this book is not just about abortion, it is also about abortion, infertility care, gender-affirming care, and where all those things are likely to go. So with that, have at it.
A round of applause for Leslie and John. Yes. How many people are online? Do we know?
What?
Oh, we had 150 people sign up to join the talk online. So just, for those in the audience, we live in a virtual world these days. So there are many other people here. But so Leslie came by my office yesterday, and we already started hashing out some of this and got really excited about this event. But I want to start with a broader question so that y'all can speak to your own expertise and experiences reading the book. Did Leslie's and John's book impact your views on federalism and or health? What overall message or takeaways did it leave you with that you want to talk about right now?
So anybody who hasn't had the opportunity to read it, I heavily encourage you to do it. And it is, we were talking up here, it's a thick book. I picked it up with my teenager son. And ever since I picked it up with him, he was like, "Dad, you got to read the book. It's really thick." It is exhaustive in the best way. Right, like it really, as somebody who is interested in federalism, who studies federalism, but within the context of kind of discrete avenues, it expanded my mind and expanded my understanding of the ways in which kind of these subnational jurisdictions shape all of the different facets of healthcare. And part of my approach and training in this has largely been focused on the economics, right? And when I think about kind of scholars of federalism over the last 50, 60 years, it was largely around, what's the price of federalism and who should be funding which programs, and Paul Peterson and Charles Thibault and all of these sorts of arguments that were being made. And what I loved most about this was the overlaying the ethics of it, and thinking about kind of what the price of federalism is, not in dollars and cents, but in the lives, the well-being of the citizenry. And I think it brings a really important lens onto this topic that was missing before. And so I'm really excited. I'll be using chapters of this book as part of classes that I'll be teaching going forward, because it really does cover just A to Z everything. And it really is an incredible amount of work.
My perspective changed pretty dramatically in looking and reading this book. I've always been interested in federalism, but almost always through a constitutional lens. And I actually spent a lot of time and effort in my career on our state Supreme Court, pushing the notion that people should take a look at the primary constitutions, namely the state constitutions, rather than, as for the last, 50, 60 years, do they teach state constitutional law here at the University of Utah? No, they do not. I taught it for 10 years, and then I had to give up, and they haven't found anybody else who's willing to do it. And yet, with the shifting within our federalist system, remarkably coming from the United States Supreme Court, the shift has been dramatic back to state constitutions as sources of individual rights. And and by the way, it's another one of those stories where you should be careful what you wish for. I look at the members of the current Supreme Court, and they've got an abortion case. They had a gerrymandering case. There's another one coming up at the trial level involving transgender students participating in high school sports. And all of those are going to be decided under language in the state constitution, not the federal. So if you can talk somebody into teaching it, see if you can get it back. The other overlay that I realized I had not focused on in my own perspectives is the bioethical program, the bioethical prism, whereby you are dealing with moral issues, you're dealing with humanitarian issues, you talked about the community issues, and that's really dramatic. I mean, one of the most interesting things is in the very first part of the book, I think I can find it fast, they've got a list in the sort of overview chapter on the state of health for bioethics, and they talk about the definition of health. I mean, if we're talking about public health, what does health mean to those who are in charge of policy and government and bioethics in general? And they quoted a list of definitive descriptions that the World Health Organization has developed to describe health to the extent they've been able. And the list is so fascinating. You know, it sounds like somebody's dream. Effective and sustainable primary health care, sustainable financing for health. I serve, as was mentioned, on the Access to Justice Commission in Utah, and medical debt is becoming one of the most serious debt-related problems. And medical debt, people lose their homes, they lose their life savings, they end up on the streets sometimes because of medical debt if insurance is inadequate. Community and civil society engagement, addressing determinants of health through rights-based and gender-responsive approaches. And what struck me on that line in particular is the World Health Organization announcing that a rights-based system is essential. We do not have a rights-based system, not only not at the federal level, but we do not have, I don't think, are there any states which have identified health rights? There's some regulatory stuff out of Medicare, maybe.
There's I love Utah's whenever I control find for the word health in the Utah state constitution, I believe the only mention as it relates to the Utah state health constitution is the health of the employee to work 40 hours a day or 40 hours a week. And so like taking it from a labor and fun, there's a professor down at BYU named Adam Brown in political science, and he's mapped this out. Utah used to have the word health in the 1980s somewhere, and then it got cut, but nobody cut it. It just disappeared. There's a handful of states that try to make it more of a right, but I think you're exactly spot on that it is few and far between, especially with states being recentered by the Supreme Court.
And because of the overall bioethics lens that the book casts for our interest, I mean, it really highlighted for me and hit me very strongly that as a nation, we have not elevated the right to health care anywhere near all kinds of other things that we have so honored. Okay.
As a scholar of migration and citizenship, I really appreciated the framing at the beginning of the book.
I'll swap.
Okay. I appreciated the framing in the beginning of the book about citizenship, belonging both at the state and the federal level, being a citizen, but also then as we go through the book, talking about people versus citizens and who has access to health care if you are, or lack of health care if you're not a citizen. I was also really appreciated the idea of movement, travel, and I sometimes in the book it's framed as moving, being able to move, as if you are picking up and changing your residence, your domicile, your location, and sometimes it's framed as travel. And that is the general solution to limited, before the differences, the disparities between states become too big, can we solve some of the inequities through travel and movement? And the answer at one level is yes, and then the answer at another level is no, we can't. And how do we hold together when there's this disparate rights, disparate access to such an essential thing as healthcare throughout the United States? I also, although the book is framed in terms of the federalism in the United States and freedom of movement and freedom of travel, I also found myself thinking about it in the broader global context as well. And who counts as somebody worthy or eligible for healthcare, and if that is defined not just by state borders but also national borders, and how what is our commitment to everyone in the world as opposed to just the people who belong within the United States in a formal sense of being a citizen or not being a citizen. The book is also a little bit personal for me because my oldest child lives in New York City. They are disabled by long COVID. They have health care basically for free in New York because of their condition, although whether or not it's permanently disabling or not permanently, we hope it's not. But as we think about how best to support them in this disability, for us, it would be easiest to move them back here to Utah. But it's not clear that they would then have access to health care if we moved them back here because of the different way New York approaches health insurance and Utah approaches health insurance. So we're trying to think about and navigate that as well. And so the book was really helpful for me to think how we might approach that, not just in our family, but more broadly as a society. And I appreciated Kavanaugh's statement that there's a right to travel in the Constitution. I don't think it's as clearly articulated as he said it in his opinion, and I think that will become a core issue as we move forward in time, and as we figure out whether or not there really is a right to travel and to go to some other jurisdiction where what you're doing is totally legal, totally fine, no problem, and then to return back to where you're domiciled or resident, a citizen of that particular state without prosecution. I think it's a very big challenge and problem that we will be thinking through.
No, I was thinking, do you want to keep asking them questions on that? Yeah, yes.
So first, there are so many things I want to pick up on here. But one thing I want to pick up on in particular is Justice Durham's point about how the Supreme Court may have led to increased federalism and therefore the devolution of authority to the states. I also want to add that Congress, in its creation of healthcare and public health programs, often has created a strong role for the states. For example, in the Affordable Care Act, which in many ways empowered states, although as part of this larger program. And so to me, that's a little bit ironic, right? We have these federal branches of government that are actually empowering the states and actually not solving the core ethical conundrum that John and Leslie's book presents, because it's empowering the states and allowing for this variation. So then that makes me think a new federal program might not resolve that either if it continues to empower federalism. Although that isn't to say that federalism is necessarily bad, and the book acknowledges that it can sometimes be good. But can you speak to the irony of how the federal government is empowering states, and also maybe speak to how we got here and where you see this moving in the future?
Well, it's a really significant, oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, you go ahead and respond.
No, I think that we are.
Okay, I didn't see the pass of the mic. You got to watch the mics. That's a really significant point, and it's not even as static as individual states going their way and then the federal government trying to set standards for them. The federal government has moved. Congress has, come in strong on some issues and then backed out of that, usually for political reasons, has, sort of not been as heavy-handed in their requirements, but given the states even more independent. What they want to do. There we go. Okay. So that was the point I wanted to make. So you've got the mic, Leslie.
I was just going to use an example. There are a number of statutes in the health arena, actually, that set a federal floor. The privacy law is a particularly good example of that. And then let states experiment and do more. Now, one of the things that, frankly, and I'll go to what Kif was saying a minute ago, is one of the very frightening things is that states' ability to protect may be under challenge over the next few years. The state of Texas just filed suit this month to be able to get access to medical records of people treated out of state. So, there's a double-edged sword here. There's the advantage of some states being more protective, even having shield laws, if people go to them for care that is legal there. But there's also the huge disadvantage if Texas can, if you sort of leave Texas wrapped in Texas cellophane or something like that, if that could be an image of Texas law. Anyway.
So I looked up the statistics on how many people have traveled out of Texas for abortion health care, and it's 171. Actually, no, Texas was about 17,000 in 2023, but people who had traveled from their home state to a different state in 2023 was 171,000 people. So it's not a small question. It's huge, and that's just for abortion health care. It's not for trans gender-affirming surgery or trans care or any of the infertility treatments, IVF, anything that is beyond abortion.
I mean, I think to the question of how did we get here, I mean, obviously the federal government's been using carrots and sticks for centuries, right, to get states to do their bidding. And, as it relates to public health, one of the very first acts that Congress passed was around quarantines in Philadelphia, right? And this is not newer stuff. I think, and again, what I found exceptionally valuable here is whenever I study, these variations and policies and it's everything, I tend to end with, hey, look, we have these big variations. So we have 171,000 individuals, and those are not randomly assigned, right? Like, these are folks that are able to afford to go somewhere else to receive needed health care. And they are folks that, that are able to take work off and go for a couple of days to California or to New Mexico or to wherever else. And so these are not random, these are not randomly assigned. And so one of the really strong points in the book is kind of the inequities and disparities that federalism magnifies, right? And I think a post-Dobbs world really magnifies this, right? And I remember, when studying state restrictions around reproductive health prior to Dobbs, it was, in general, one of three things. One was restrictions around on workforce. One was restrictions around like facilities and doorway frames and those sorts of things. And then one was restrictions placed on patients, right? And they overlap to try and make it more difficult. But even at the end of the day, it was still a right. It was still accessible. And now we've just thrown, gasoline on that fire and making it exponentially more difficult.
We also got here in part through COVID, and how COVID as a health matter affected society, and how we structure society, and how we allow or don't allow movement, and whether or not movement during COVID actually increased risk for everybody or decreased risk. But the Supreme Court decisions with respect to what states could or localities could or could not do with respect to COVID precautions also helped us move to where we are in terms of both giving states and localities power, but also pulling some of that power back when it was framed as impinging on religious liberties or impinging on churches' abilities to have congregations.
One of the things that troubles me, and I haven't begun to plumb the depths of the problem, but I have a personal story. We moved to Utah in the early 70s, and I was barred in North Carolina, where I had taken the bar exam, and I arrived in Utah. I think we came in 73, and the Utah State Bar had a policy which prohibited anyone from taking the Utah bar exam until they had lived in the state for 6 months. Now, I sat through constitutional law first year and heard about the right to travel, but I didn't think it was a good idea to begin my legal career in a new state by suing the state bar. So there are all kinds of barriers. But one of the things that troubles me is part of the challenge to that, not just the right to travel, but we have a provision in our state constitution, which is the counterpart in some respects to the Equal Protection Clause in the federal Constitution, and it's the uniform operation of the laws provision. And you could have, it seemed to me that you could challenge that either under the right to travel or under the uniform operation of the laws, because one Utah citizen gets one set of policy and another who's been there longer gets a different one. Isn't that a failure of uniform operation of the laws? And see, that's my bent as a lawyer and a former judge. I go for the legal solution rather than the moral one, except that underlying the uniform operation of the laws and the equal protection clauses, of course, they have their bases in human rights. And I continue to be extraordinarily challenged by and distressed by the notion that, for example, the control of your own body and your access to its care from professionals is determined by where you live and by what your legislature does as opposed to what someone else's legislature does. And I don't know how you get to that moral, and you talk a lot about this in the book, and it's a significant problem. How is it that we might move to a stage where we could reach consensus on what basic humanitarian principles we will live under? And you've got a solution for that, right?
Yeah. Is this working? Yeah. Great. Okay, so one of the things that keep in mind is that on one important level, every day, this is a nation of state and federal law. But it's also a nation given to bouts of pragmatism, and that should never be underestimated. So the first federal hospitals were actually in the 1820s and 30s in port cities because the federal government had responsibility. So you had a disease on your ship, where you're going to put them, you're going to put them in a hospital, but the state wasn't that keen on that. So therefore, you were creating essentially a federal hospital. And then the great alliance that dominated post-Civil War politics were the veterans associations from the Civil War, both at the state level, but more importantly at the federal level. And that also got a lot of resources from anything from medically related issues to pensions and everything else. So we've always had, things have kind of changed have changed over the years, but there's always been this notion of, is there another way to do this? And also, whenever we were going west, what did we give people? We gave them land. That was the one thing the federal government had. It didn't have money, but it had land. And later it had money. So that in general, the kind of notion of using land and then setting some aside, which is still true in Utah, right, for state-related activities, all that goes all the way through this theme on how we looked at health and things like that. And my last kind of comment, which we didn't actually include in the book, there's a wonderful article in Political Science, wonderful in quotes, that essentially talks about all the programs, not the programs, but the theories of programs that we have, like, is it a relationship that's bilateral? Is it something else? There are maybe 40 different names for federalism in practice. And I think that is one of the important kind of themes to keep in mind, that when in doubt, we create a new way of thinking at the problem and who's going to pay and what's going to happen. And that's more than I should have said. But there we go.
Just to pick up on another theme that, this book was the result of 8 or 10 years of dialogue between the two of us, too. And one of the points that John kept making about movement is that it can signal that an experiment is failing. And it may ultimately bring public policy change. So Idaho right now is hemorrhaging doctors. And whether Idaho will wake up and realize that it doesn't have any doctors anymore, we don't know. But that may have some level of influence on.
We have seized the microphone of the.
Can you go to the next question just because we're really low on time? Okay. You can leave it in. Yeah. Okay. We have time for one more question from me, and then we're going to turn to the audience Q&A. Please put your questions into this website, slido.com, enter the code. We're about to go to audience Q&A. And I'm sorry for asking such a challenging question as my last question when you only have 5 minutes. We got to be done with this question by 1:05 so that we have 10 minutes for the audience Q&A. Okay. The thing about this book is I'm left with this unease that we can't categorize these programs in a theoretically sound way, that federalism can be really good for health, really bad for health, everything depends. And as much as my 1L inner self wants to say it depends is a good answer, I want something more. And so I want to ask y'all, can you try to clean up all of this information and present a cohesive understanding of what to do with federalism? Where should we go from here? And to frame this, I want to first point out that Kif continues to mention movement. Movement is one of the answers, as she notes, to federalism's problems, although perhaps not a fully satisfactory one. Also, we have the problem that sometimes the federal government does bad things, in which case state variation can be really helpful. On the other hand, sometimes states are doing bad things themselves, in which case maybe we want a federal floor. Of course, then that brings in the fact that the federal government doesn't always work as we want. I'll bring up the current FAFSA dysfunction, where students are unable to apply for financial aid due to at least 50 glitches in the federal website. So how do you clean all of this messiness and variation up? What is your cohesive theory of federalism? We have 5 minutes.
I don't have one. But one of the things I'm thinking of is that there are so many working parts of the system. For example, we deal with the Congress, and more recently we have been dealing big time with the United States Supreme Court. And if you look at the history of constitutional law, particularly in the criminal law area and other areas, if you look back, you see state constitutional provisions which have gradually been accepted by the United States Supreme Court and become national law. But I don't see that happening at the present time. I don't see states that disagree with the direction in which we're heading, the states that don't, and their courts are upholding that. I don't see that having much influence on the United States Supreme Court in the fashion in which it is operating these days. It's really, there really has become such a close connection between the court and the political policies of the administration and Congress that I don't think some of the old ways that we changed the law over time were very helpful. And I think it's highly unlikely that we'll be able to get national consensus through traditional methods. And although I do think there's a good point in pursuing the notion that if over 150,000, no, 100, under 75, yeah, out of Texas are moving to get legitimate health care in another venue, and they're the ones who can afford it, right? They're not everybody else in Texas. And it may be that will have an impact on the moral response of the populace nationwide, but I wish I were more optimistic about that. I never suggested this, but it frankly occurred to me that this book should have said states of health with a question mark. Because what they've done in this book is to just raise, did anybody count the number of issues you've raised? And the idea that there's a cleanup methodology that has emerged at this point in time, but it's a very valuable book because of what it focuses on.
Erwin Chemerinsky has a new book out. I can't remember the exact title, but something lurching towards secession. It may be the title. Maybe that's where we're at. I don't think that's necessarily. That's a terrifying idea. But he also suggests that part of the problem is the Constitution and the way the Constitution is structured. So I just want to put that out there as an idea. And then I also want to say, vote, 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 vote. Because whatever our structures of government, the people in power who are implementing and confronting those limitations and running past them and blowing through them, we can vote them out, maybe. In theory. If you get rid of gerrymandering, well, I'm trying to be a little bit hopeful. Okay, so I threw Chemerinsky out there, and so I want to just, but people as a whole acting together can make a difference. And I'm crossing my fingers for people who are on Zoom.
I That was actually the question that I wanted to pose to the Francises on like how should I feel about this after I finish reading it. I will say one of the thoughts that struck me, and we're now at 1:05, so I will stop soon, is several of us have mentioned like floors, right? It used to be so the federal government would set some baseline of who is eligible for Medicaid, for example, and like what benefits you had a right to. And it didn't matter if you were in Minnesota or in Louisiana, like you would have access to those things if you met those eligibility criteria set by the federal government. Minnesota would go above and beyond what Mississippi or Louisiana would do, but there was at least a floor. And my concern now is the floor is gone, right? Like, so that baseline and losing that baseline for me is scary and depressing.
I'll say something.
Sorry, I couldn't tell.
Oh, no, yeah. No, so I think the point to kind of keep in mind is federalism is not something that once you've achieved it, it's a stable operation. Anywhere where federalism exists, it does to some extent, for example, say in Italy, or in it's more integrated in Germany. But everywhere it is around, it varies a lot in practice. And that can be very disconcerting. The only really positive, I mean, what you might want to achieve is some version of Social Security, but for healthcare, where the system exists outside. We leave federalism someplace else, and we just provide this as a system. And maybe that's would be a way of overcoming the injustice of healthcare.
So this is a more philosophical point. We are non-ideal theorists. We don't think there's a perfect answer. So in part, we challenge your question because we think that, as John just said, we think that in a way, this is very pragmatic. It's in the American pragmatist sense, continuing to try to do more, achieve greater inclusion, achieve greater justice, using where we can the federal government in the right way and state governments in the right way.
Thank you all. These are amazing answers, super interesting insights, even if you challenge the premises of my question. All right, I'm gonna pair two questions as part of a lightning round because we have 7 minutes left. These are the two top voted questions. Number one from Professor Chen Ying in the audience. What's the best case legal scenario for our public health debacle? Is it federal constitutionalization of a right to health? What would such a right look like in the best case scenario? Question two from Anonymous. I am wondering if or where in your book this conversation on the differences in health status, public health funding, and policies applies to the Indian Health Service and tribes. So speak to what you would like to in this lightning round.
So in general, in public health, it works largely by some federal incentives, data gathering, sharing of information. Chunks of how we handled the pandemic remind me of how it was dealt with in 1918, 1919, where there was just enormous variation among cities in how they looked towards issues of vaccination. It wasn't really until the 1940s that vaccination became widely accepted in the country. And then, and more recently, it's eroded in some areas, which has become, I think, a major problem. So that one of the, and also the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, though it sometimes enjoys a favorable reputation, it has been unable to consolidate that position. We really want to go to Germany, where the equivalent one, when it speaks with authority. That's something we've not been able to do in our own country. So I would love, at least of anything, how we might strengthen public service as a sustained, collaborative, and institutionalized approach. I think we might come out ahead.
Yeah, public health is one of the things that we think of the connectedness point nationally. Apologies, we didn't really deal with the issue of tribal health. We thought about it, but it just would have been too much and raise a whole additional set of issues that the book is already 430 pages long, and that's not to say it isn't a tremendously important issue. It is.
As I think one of two people here who doesn't have a JD, it's very dangerous for me to say, like, what's the like perfect legal kind of response to gaining kind of a rights-based approach to health and public health. That being said, we have a lot of models we can look towards, right? Like, we can look to other countries to see how they have kind of attempted to bring kind of health and public health further into this rights base, to be able to expand access to nearly everyone, while also operating in a federal system. On that list that Leslie had at the very beginning, I mean, Germany and Canada, Mexico, we have places that we can look to try to improve because we need to. And so legally, I don't have the answer, but politically and from a policy perspective, like, we have ample places for us to be able to emulate in this process.
In 2022, 2023, I was on sabbatical, and we lived for 5 months in Denmark. And once I got, which was a challenge, once we got the residence permit for living in Denmark, what came with it? Assignment to a specific doctor in our area. I got my health card, I had my doctor's name on it. I didn't have to do any looking. I didn't have to do anything else. We didn't get charged for any of it. We started getting all of the tests that they were sending out to all the residents and citizens in the mail. And so, we had the colon screening stuff. We could just do it. When my husband had an issue, he just walked over to the doctor and got a day of appointment, and everybody was taken care of. It is a country of only 5.5 million people, and so it's also quite homogenous despite more recent immigration. But we were taken care of, and that was a very different experience than when I have moved to other places in the world or moved across the United States and tried to figure out who's the pediatrician going to be? Are they accepting new patients? I didn't have a choice in who my doctor was, but I had health care. But I had a doctor. My older sister and her family live in New Zealand. All 4 of her children are doctors or studying to become doctors. I've had good friends who've lived in New Zealand, and the basic health care is really, really, really terrific. But once you hit the maximum, once you hit the new experimental treatments, if you want the cancer treatment that will save your life or at least give you another 4 or 5 years with your kids, that's not available. And so that family moved from New Zealand back to the United States, where the $1 million, $2 million, $3 million cancer treatment was available. So I think we've got some good examples for basic care, generally good care, but not necessarily for the really exceptional cases. And I also just want to say the book is,
We're about out of time.
okay, I just say the book is highly accessible, super accessible. Everybody's saying how long it is and it's really exhaustive, but it is so, so, so accessible.
1 minute, 1 minute. I just want to say this is very complicated. If you answer the question, what does a human being need to live a decent human life? You have to say shelter, you have to say nutrition. You hope that education is on the list, but maybe you can live a decent life without it. It's not as much fun. And you need access to health care. And we have not, as a society, politically or otherwise, come to the point that we're willing to really tackle those issues for everyone. And frankly, I'm not anti-capitalism, but I think capitalism has done a lot of damage to efforts to solve those problems.
That was a great closing point. With that, please thank our panelists. A round of applause. And have a wonderful weekend. Thank you.